I'm out here in my Milanese harness. This is from the middle of the 15th century. This is real steel and it's used for proper combat. I wear this at festivals and events sometimes, and there are a series of questions that I always get asked. One of the questions I'm always asked is, how heavy is your armour? Well, that's fairly straightforward to answer because I've just weighed myself, including the helmet, but no swords or saddlery. I normally weigh around 82 kilos-ish, which is about 12 stone, maybe 12.5 stone after a big meal. And when I've got my armour on, I weigh just over 18 stone, just over around 112, 113 kilos. You get very used to wearing it though, so it doesn't cause me too much trouble. It is awkward to move around in sometimes, and it's incredibly noisy. One of the questions asked most often by generally small children is, can you go to the toilet when wearing your armour? And the simple answer is yes, you can, but it's quite noisy. Now, I know on the battlefield it's fairly likely that if you're in battle line, you're not going to be able to retire to go to the toilet, and probably weren't toilets around anyway. There certainly weren't those porta cabins that we have at events, or those thunder boxes as some people call them. So I'm afraid the reality of it is, if you needed to go, you'd probably go where you were standing. And I think that is quite likely. And we know that some battles were fought with lots of the participants having dysentery. So they were going to be going to the toilet all the time anyway, regardless whether they wanted to or not. So yes, you can go to the toilet. One of the things that's a little awkward though is all of this area here. So if you want to go to the toilet, you have to just sort of hoist this up, and then you sit down and go. And then when you're finished, you just drop everything into place and off you go. So going to the loo in armour is not subtle, but it is completely possible. Something I've been asked is, can you sleep in the armour? And I have slept badly in my armour once. It is possible. It's uncomfortable. You do get a kind of rest, a kind of sleep. It is a bad night's sleep and you end up really aching in it. I didn't sleep in my helmet, so I took the helmet off, but I did sleep in my back and breast, my arms, my legs. So I am in, 9/10 of the armour. Yes, you can, but I wouldn't advise it. I would suggest that what people did is just quickly take their armour off, go to sleep, get up in the morning, quickly put their armour on if they needed to. There were not many situations in the medieval times when there would be night attacks. Nighttime fighting was quite rare and chaotic for everybody. And so the chances of actually coordinating a decent night attack as opposed to a night raid maybe are slim to none. So we don't know of many combats that actually took place at night time. So you wouldn't really need your armour on at night, although for fun you can do it, but you don't sleep very well. Wearing armour is just wearing a metal box. It extracts heat from you, and weirdly at the wrong kind of weather it actually keeps the heat in. So if you are in really cold weather, you get really cold because the steel absorbs the heat from your body and radiates it out. You put layers over the top. This kind of armour was close fitted to the body, so you do not wear a gambeson underneath it. Gambesons are an earlier period armour. This is mid to late 15th century, and it is just worn with what's called an arming doublet underneath. So there isn't that much warmth. You can wear a few layers of silk, for example, underneath it if you really wanted to, but generally speaking you would put your warm layers over the top is what I think is likely to have happened. Or, more likely than not, you don't fight in the cold. And one of the funny things is, sometimes when I'm doing displays, talking to the general public at a stately home or a castle, I lay my armour out in front of me. We have to be very careful to cover the armour up, especially if it's summer. Even in England it can get reasonably warm here, and the armour will get positively hot. It will get so hot that it's actually hard to touch. So you have to be quite careful to not actually leave it out in the baking sun for very long. And imagine a hotter country. Imagine how hot this kind of armour would have got in Italy, for example, in southern Italy. I think they probably would have not worn as much as this, let alone places like the Middle East and fighting in desert environments. This kind of armour would be I think close to lethal actually, if you were having to wear it for very long, even with plenty of water. So it gets incredibly cold in cold weather, and it gets incredibly hot in hot weather. Armour like this is custom made, and there are not many people in the world that can actually make it. So it is quite expensive to buy. You can get a reasonable suit of harness like this made for, I would say, around $10,000, £8,000, something like that. And it goes up from there. You can get armour made for tens of thousands, or a lot more than that. I know one person with armour that cost nearly £40,000, which is about, I don't know, something approaching $50,000. Had a lot of gold on it though, so that probably added to the cost. But it was a fantastic piece of armour. He uses it practically. It gets hit by lances, it gets hit by swords and maces, and is used properly. And I think that's part of the wonder of armour, is it's very expensive, and it was back then, it was very expensive. But it also gets used, and it gets broken, and it has to be repaired, and it has to be modified. And I've noticed that my own armour, when I first ordered it, fitted in a certain way. As I've changed shape, as I got fitter, it needed to be put on slightly differently, and straps get worn out, pieces break, rivets have to be replaced. So your armour is a living ecosystem, if you like. It is changing all the time, and I bet you back then it was exactly the same. You would commission a suit of armour, it would probably take 2 to 3 years before you actually had it delivered. And when you'd had it delivered, you would try it out, and you would find bits that annoyed you if you were not very lucky, and you would want them modifying. You might decide that parts caught awkwardly in a certain movement, or parts needed to be changed, they're uncomfortable, they dug in a little bit when you were riding, for example. Because when you are testing out armour, often you're not going to be on a horse straight away. I'm lucky I can get on a horse and test it out, but other people don't own their own horses, especially today. So riding on a horse in armour for the first time might be quite a different experience for many people, and you discover stuff by using it. I've asked sometimes, have I ever been knocked off the horse in the joust? And the answer is no, I haven't. I've never been unlucky enough to be knocked off the horse. I have struck 3 people from the saddle though in jousts over the time. All have been good friends of mine, which means that actually knocking somebody off the saddle makes you feel good and bad in equal measure. You feel quite guilty that you might have hurt your friend, but luckily they were all okay. They were a bit winded. In one case they were swearing a lot, but they all took it in good spirits, which is what jousting should be. It should be done with a positive, sportsmanlike, chivalric attitude. So I have been lucky enough to strike 3 people from the saddle in my time jousting. Has anything ever gone wrong when you're jousting? Yes. Lots of things have gone wrong. One of the funniest things perhaps is that I was in the Tower of London. I was jousting as a guest of the historic royal palaces, Her Majesty's palaces, and a fly flew into my helmet, and I then had to do a run with a fly buzzing backwards and forwards in my eye slot. And you can imagine me, I was sitting there on the horse with a lance like this, trying to blow the fly out of my helmet. The fly did go out of my helmet at some stage, but I don't know. I had to concentrate on what I was doing. And I imagined that that must have happened perhaps more so back then. Perhaps there were more flies in London back in the medieval period because of the nature of the sanitation and the nature of the Thames at the time. So it's fairly possible that somebody like Henry VIII, when he was jousting, would have had flies flying into his helmet, bouncing around and flying out. It did occur to me afterwards that I didn't actually know whether it was a fly or not. It could have been a wasp, which would have probably changed things quite dramatically. But at the time, I just thought it was annoying and it was a fly. But if it had been a wasp and it had stung me, that could have been really quite dangerous. But there's nothing you can do. You have your closed visor and you're ready to go. And you can't really stop the proceedings to try to get your helmet taken off and removed. I mean, if you were the king, you probably could, but where we were doing it, it was not really feasible to do that. So I went down the list anyway, struck reasonably well, and the fly had gone. So at some stage, I guess the fly must have flown back out again. One of the things that I also want to talk about is vision through the helmet. So this is my helmet. You can see what little view I have to see my opponent or see somebody in combat, which I think is why a lot of people fought with the visors up some of the time, because you just can't see anything. You have to gamble that your face is not going to get struck, which of course is a gamble some people lost. Kings even lost that gamble from time to time. You also want to be able to see in combat, and so a fully enclosed helmet like this just doesn't allow you to see or hear very well, but it is super protective. I've got my helmet on now. I hope you can hear me, because one of the problems with the helmet is that it muffles the voice. This is an armet, a style of helmet that is typical of the late medieval period. You can see how much of my face is available to see or to breathe. I can breathe through this bit here. This is very Italian, and there's mail under here to kind of close the gap. Right now, with my visor up, I can see reasonably well. I can move my head, I can see around, but with the visor down, there's a very narrow slot that I see through. It's horizontal, so I can see from about here to about here, but it's about a centimetre, about half an inch wide. It's designed to deflect lances away from my eye. If I close the visor, you can see that's the only vulnerable bit. You've got to see, and a lance can go through that slot. So it needs to be as small as you can possibly get away with. But what it means is you can see your target, you can see the person who you're going to be hitting with your lance, but you can't see much else. It's very, very protective, of course, but if you want to be properly protected, because one of the problems in a joust is if the visor is down, the visor can be knocked upwards, by a blow from below, and that will knock the visor up, and then the lance will go into your face, which is a bad thing to happen, an extremely bad and dangerous thing. And we know historically people die with lances in the face. This is called a wrapper. This is a solid piece, like the prow of a ship actually, solid piece of metal that goes over the front of my helmet. This sits in front of my face about here, means there's nothing that can actually knock the visor upwards. It's beautifully constructed and the curves all fit together and it feels very secure. But you could easily fight with your helmet like this, and you can move and you can see, you can be heard but not particularly well. You can't hear very well. I feel like I'm wearing a pair of headphones, really. You know, those sound suppressing headphones. So when you're in a joust, you end up having to listen very carefully to what's going on. The thing to remember is, when you have the visor closed, you cannot see downwards. So if you're on a horse and you're 8 foot in the air, which you are, you will not see anybody around you for about 10 feet. 10 feet away, you literally won't see anybody, and you won't see your horse. So when I'm riding, I have to ride through memory alone and remembering where my hand is, because I cannot see my hand and I cannot see my horse. So I have to use my skill of riding to know which way the horse is pointing, to know how the horse is behaving. And I've got to do all of that one-handed while holding a lance in this hand. You have to be very careful with the ground crew. In fact, it's the other way around. The ground crew have to know that you, as the knight who's jousting, can't actually see them. So if somebody's standing here, I have no idea. I can't hear them, I can't see them. And if I was to move my horse sideways and they weren't ready for it, I might hurt them. So there's a lot of hidden dangers. Jousting at the highest level is an incredibly stressful, incredibly difficult and incredibly skillful job. It requires martial ability, it requires physical stamina, it requires quite a lot of fitness, and it requires a certain calmness of spirit, because wearing all of this stuff can become incredibly claustrophobic. One of the interesting things might be that the people with the worst view of the joust are the two jousters. You actually can't see much, and if you do a big hit, you know, you can feel there's a hit, but you'll be tipped backwards slightly and you won't see anything. You will see opponent, 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 bang, sky, 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 and then you can see the ground again. So there's a moment where you're literally looking up if you're hit and you can't see anything other than the sky.